Jake Morrison sat in the back of the shuttle, watching Earth grow larger through the small window. He had not been back to the home planet in 3 years. The blue marble looked peaceful from up here, but Jake knew better. Down there, politicians were fighting over every word he had spoken during the war. The shuttle pilot, a young woman named Amy, kept glancing at him in the mirror. Jake could see her trying to work up the courage to say something. Finally, she spoke. "Sir, are you really going on Lisa Hamilton's show?" Jake nodded without looking away from the window. "That's the plan." "Why would you do that?" "She hates military people. She'll try to make you look bad." Jake almost smiled. Amy was probably 25 years old. She had never seen real combat. She had never watched friends die while politicians back home argued about the proper way to fight a war. "Sometimes you have to walk into the lion's den," Jake said quietly. The shuttle touched down at the New York spaceport 2 hours later. Jake grabbed his small bag and walked down the ramp. The air on Earth smelled different than the recycled atmosphere on the colony ships. It was fresher, but somehow felt thin to him now. A man in an expensive suit was waiting for him. The man had perfectly styled hair and a smile that looked practiced. He stuck out his hand as Jake approached. "Captain Morrison, I'm Tony Walsh from Galactic Perspectives. We're so excited to have you on the show." Jake shook the man's hand. Tony's grip was soft, like someone who had never done hard work. "Just Jake is fine." Of course. Let me take you to the hotel. You can rest up before tomorrow's taping." They climbed into a fancy car that drove itself through the busy streets. Tony kept talking about ratings and viewer numbers. Jake watched the city go by outside the window. Everything looked clean and new. There were no blast marks on the buildings, no memorial walls with names of the dead, no children with haunted eyes. The hotel was 50 stories tall and covered in glass. Jake's room was on the 40th floor. Through the window he could see the Hudson River and the old Statue of Liberty. The statue had been repaired after the Zentari attack 5 years ago, but Jake could still see where the new metal had been welded on. Jake's phone buzzed. A message from his old friend Pete Johnson appeared on the screen. Pete was still out on the rim worlds keeping watch for Zentari raiders. "Saw the news about your TV appearance." "You sure about this, old man?" Jake typed back quickly. "Someone needs to tell the truth. Be careful. These media types are a different kind of enemy." Jake set the phone down and looked out at the city again. Pete was right. The media was a different kind of enemy. They fought with words instead of weapons. They attacked your reputation instead of your body. But Jake had learned something during 30 years in the service. The truth was stronger than any lie, as long as someone was brave enough to tell it. The next morning, Tony picked him up in the same fancy car. This time they drove to the studio building. It was even taller than the hotel, with huge screens on the outside showing advertisements and news feeds. Inside, the building was all glass and metal. Everything looked expensive and important. People in suits hurried around carrying tablets and talking into small devices attached to their ears. They all looked busy, but Jake wondered if any of them had ever done anything that actually mattered. Tony led him through a maze of hallways to a dressing room. A woman with bright pink hair immediately started fussing over Jake's appearance. "Oh, honey, we need to do something about that scar on your cheek, and your hair needs styling." "When was the last time you saw a proper barber?" Jake looked at himself in the mirror. The scar on his cheek was from a Zentari plasma blade. His hair was gray and cut short, military style. His face was weathered from years on different worlds under different suns. He looked exactly like what he was, a soldier who had seen too much war. "Leave it," he said quietly. The pink-haired woman looked shocked. "But the cameras will pick up every flaw. We need to make you look good for television." I said leave it. Tony stepped forward quickly. "Of course, Jake. Whatever you're comfortable with." They led him to another room where he could watch the show's opening on a monitor. The theme music was loud and dramatic. Graphics flashed across the screen showing spaceships and alien worlds. Then Lisa Hamilton appeared. She was younger than Jake had expected, maybe 40 years old. Her blonde hair was perfect, her makeup flawless. She wore a blue suit that probably cost more than most soldiers made in a month. When she smiled for the camera, her teeth were so white they almost glowed. "Good evening, and welcome to Galactic Perspectives," she said in a smooth voice. "I'm Lisa Hamilton. Tonight we have a very special guest, Captain Jake Morrison, the so-called hero of the Outer Rim conflicts. We'll be discussing his controversial tactics and what they mean for humanity's future in the galaxy." The way she said so-called hero made Jake's jaw tighten. He had not asked to be called a hero. He had just done his job. But thousands of colonists were alive today because of the decisions he had made. Tony appeared at his elbow. "Ready, Jake? You go on in 5 minutes." Jake stood up and straightened his simple green uniform. He had not worn his medals tonight. The families of the dead did not need to see him decorated for doing what was necessary. As he walked toward the stage, Jake thought about the colonists on New Austin. The Zentari had surrounded their settlement for 3 weeks. The politicians on Earth had wanted to negotiate. They had wanted to find a peaceful solution. While they talked, children were starving behind the Zentari blockade. Jake had not waited for permission. He had taken his ships and broken the blockade. The politicians had called it an act of aggression. The colonists had called it salvation. Now, it was time to tell the real story. Jake Morrison walked onto the stage ready to face a different kind of battle. The studio lights were bright and hot. Jake walked onto the stage and saw Lisa Hamilton sitting behind a curved desk that looked like it was made from a single piece of white stone. She stood up as he approached, her smile wide but cold. "Captain Morrison, thank you for joining us tonight," she said, extending her hand. Jake shook it briefly. Her grip was firm, practiced. This was someone who knew how to perform for the cameras. "Just Jake," he said as they sat down. The cameras were rolling. Now, Jake could see the red lights on top of each one. Around the edges of the studio he spotted the audience. About 200 people in expensive clothes, all watching him with curious eyes. Most of them looked like they had never been off Earth. Lisa shuffled her papers and looked directly into the main camera. "Tonight we're speaking with Captain Jake Morrison, the military officer whose actions in the Outer Rim have sparked debate across the colonies. Captain Morrison, let's start with the obvious question. Do you consider yourself a war criminal?" Jake blinked slowly. He had expected her to start strong, but this was beyond what he had imagined. The audience murmured with excitement. "No," Jake said simply. Lisa leaned forward, her eyes bright with anticipation. "Really? Because the reports from the Kepler 7 incident suggest otherwise. You ordered the bombing of civilian areas. Innocent people died because of your commands." "The Centauri were using those buildings as weapons depots," Jake replied. "We gave 3 warnings for civilians to evacuate. Most did." "Most?" Lisa's voice rose dramatically. "What about the ones who didn't? What about the families who couldn't leave their homes? Do their lives mean nothing to you?" Jake felt his hands tighten on the arms of his chair. He forced himself to stay calm. Every death in war is a tragedy, but those weapons depots were supplying the forces that were killing colonists every day. Sometimes you have to make hard choices. Lisa turned to look at the audience, her expression one of shocked disbelief. "Hard choices, ladies and gentlemen, you heard it here. Captain Morrison thinks murdering civilians is a hard choice." "I never said that," Jake said quietly. "Didn't you?" Lisa spun back to face him. "Let's talk about your other hard choices. The Vega colony massacre. You had Zentari prisoners, and instead of following proper procedures, you let your soldiers execute them." Jake's jaw tightened. Those weren't prisoners. They were caught in the act of torturing colonist children. My soldiers saw what was happening and acted. "Without orders?" "I gave the orders." The audience gasped. Lisa's smile grew wider. "So you admit to ordering the execution of prisoners of war?" "I ordered the stopping of war crimes in progress," Jake said. "Those Zentari were skinning children alive for sport. Would you have preferred we asked them nicely to stop?" "I would have preferred you follow the law," Lisa shot back. "The Galactic Warfare Convention clearly states that prisoners must be treated humanely, regardless of their actions." The convention was written by people who never saw combat, Jake said. It's easy to talk about humanity when you're sitting in a safe office on Earth. Lisa stood up suddenly, pacing behind her desk like a predator circling prey. This is exactly the problem, Captain. You think the rules don't apply to you. You think because you wear a uniform, you can decide who lives and dies. I think because I wear a uniform, I have a responsibility to protect innocent people. By becoming a monster yourself? The words hung in the air. Jake looked at Lisa for a long moment. Her perfectly styled hair, her flawless makeup, her expensive clothes, everything about her screamed safety and comfort. Have you ever been off Earth? Jake asked. Lisa looked surprised by the question. What does that have to do with anything? Have you? I've traveled extensively for stories. I've been to Mars, to the Europa stations. Have you been to the colonies that were attacked? Lisa waved her hand dismissively. I don't see how my travel history is relevant to your war crimes, because you're sitting here calling me a monster, and you've never seen what monsters actually do. Jake leaned forward slightly. The studio had grown quiet. Even the audience seemed to be holding their breath. The Zentari don't just kill people, Jake continued. They study pain. They see how long they can keep someone alive while they take them apart piece by piece. They record the screams and play them back to break the spirits of other prisoners. Lisa tried to interrupt, but Jake kept talking. On Harmony Station, they captured a school, 200 children between the ages of 5 and 15. When we found that school 3 days later, the walls were covered in blood. The Zentari had made the older children watch while they dissected the younger ones. Then they made them help. The audience was completely silent now. Several people looked sick. The survivors begged us to kill them, Jake said quietly. 10-year-old children begging soldiers to end their lives because they couldn't live with what they had been forced to see and do. Lisa had stopped pacing. Her face was pale beneath her makeup. You want to talk about monsters? Jake asked. I've seen monsters. I've fought them. And sometimes, to stop a monster, you have to do terrible things. But the difference between me and them is that I don't enjoy it. That's not the point, Lisa said, but her voice had lost its confident edge. There are rules, there are procedures. You can't just what? Just save lives? Jake stood up now, his voice still quiet but carrying clearly through the studio. While you were here on Earth debating procedures, children were dying. While politicians argued about the proper way to handle the situation, entire families were being wiped out. Lisa tried to regain control. But surely there were other options. Negotiation, diplomacy. We tried diplomacy for 6 months, Jake said. Every day we negotiated, more colonists died. The Zentari don't understand mercy, they see it as weakness. You're painting an entire species as evil, Lisa accused. That's exactly the kind of thinking that leads to genocide. Jake looked at her with something close to pity. I'm not painting anyone as anything. I'm telling you what I saw with my own eyes, what thousands of my soldiers saw, what the colonists who survived will never forget. He sat back down, suddenly looking tired. You live in a world where problems can be solved with words and good intentions. I lived in a world where children were being murdered while those words were being spoken. The audience was completely silent. Lisa looked around desperately, trying to find her footing again. She had expected to easily destroy this old soldier, but something had gone wrong. The man sitting across from her wasn't the bloodthirsty monster she had painted him as. He was something much more dangerous to her. Narrative. He was someone who had been right. Lisa Hamilton took a deep breath and straightened her shoulders. She was not used to being on the defensive. For 15 years, she had controlled every interview on her show. Politicians, generals, business leaders, they all crumbled under her questioning. But Jake Morrison was different. He was not playing by the rules she knew. She walked back to her desk and picked up a tablet. Let's talk numbers, Captain Morrison. According to official reports, your campaigns resulted in over 50,000 Zentari deaths. How do you justify that level of destruction? Jake looked at her calmly. How many human colonists were killed before I arrived? That's not what I asked. It's the only question that matters. Jake's voice remained steady. Before my task force reached the outer rim, the Zentari had killed over 200,000 colonists. Men, women, children, entire settlements wiped out. Lisa waved her hand dismissively. Those numbers are disputed. Many experts believe the military exaggerated casualty figures to justify aggressive action. What experts? Jake asked. Scholars from the Institute for Galactic Peace. Dr. Helen Carter has published several papers questioning official casualty reports. Jake almost smiled. Dr. Carter? Has she ever been to the Outer Rim? She doesn't need to travel there to analyze data. She analyzed data from her office on Earth while people were dying. Jake leaned forward. I held those bodies in my arms. I saw the faces of parents who watched their children murdered. Dr. Carter saw numbers on a screen. The audience was listening intently now. Some of them were starting to look uncomfortable. They had come expecting to see a war criminal exposed. Instead, they were hearing something very different. Lisa tried a new approach. But your methods were extreme. The orbital bombardment of Titan base resulted in massive environmental damage. That planet may never recover. Titan base was the Zentari command center for the entire sector, Jake replied. It was heavily fortified and surrounded by civilian shields. We offered surrender terms. They responded by executing 50 prisoners on live broadcast. So you decided to destroy an entire ecosystem? Jake was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was softer than before. I had a choice. I could spend 6 months trying to take that base with ground forces, losing thousands of my soldiers and giving the Zentari time to kill more colonists. Or I could end it quickly, by committing an environmental war crime, by saving lives. Jake looked directly at Lisa. The bombardment lasted 4 hours. It destroyed the base and ended Zentari operations in that sector. The environmental damage can be repaired in 50 years. The people who would have died cannot be brought back. Lisa felt the interview slipping away from her. The audience was nodding along with Jake's words. She needed to regain control. She pulled up another file on her tablet. Let's discuss your relationship with Colonel Bill Hayes. According to sources, you ordered him executed for refusing to follow orders. Jake's expression hardened. Bill Hayes was my friend for 20 years. He was also my second in command. And you had him killed. I relieved him of duty and ordered a court-martial. The reports say he died in custody before the trial. Bill killed himself, Jake said quietly. He couldn't live with what he had seen. Lisa pounced on this. What had he seen that was so terrible? What did you order him to do? Jake was silent for a long moment. The studio was completely quiet. Even the camera operators had stopped moving. The Zentari had taken a medical station, Jake finally said. 3,000 patients and staff. They were using the hospital as a base, knowing we wouldn't attack a medical facility. So, you did attack it? No. I ordered a rescue mission. Bill was supposed to lead a small team to evacuate the patients before we hit the military targets. Jake's hands clenched into fists on the chair arms. When his team got inside, they found that the Zentari had been using the patients for experiments, testing new weapons, new torture methods. The hospital basement was full of body parts. Several people in the audience looked away. One woman put her hand over her mouth. Bill's team found children who had been partially dissected while still alive, medical staff who had been forced to help with the experiments. The Zentari kept detailed records. They were proud of their work. Lisa tried to interrupt, but Jake kept talking. Bill couldn't handle it. He broke down completely. When I ordered the attack on the military sections of the station, he refused, said we should negotiate for the release of the survivors. That sounds reasonable. Jake looked at her with something close to anger for the first time. There were no survivors. The Zentari had killed everyone in the hospital 3 days before we arrived. They were using recordings of screams to make us think people were still alive. The audience was completely silent now. Several people were crying. Bill spent 2 weeks thinking he could have saved those people if he had acted faster. The guilt ate him alive. The night before his court-martial, he took his service weapon and ended his pain. Lisa's tablet trembled in her hands. This was not going according to plan. She was supposed to be exposing a war criminal, not listening to horror, stories that made her guest look like a hero. "You're saying the Zentari were unusually cruel," she said weakly. "I'm saying they were exactly what they appeared to be. A species that enjoys causing suffering." While Earth politicians debated the finer points of interspecies relations, the Centauri were turning humans into laboratory experiments. Jake stood up again. His movement was slow, deliberate. He looked around the studio, making eye contact with audience members. "You want to know why I did what I did? Because someone had to. Because while you all sat here on Earth discussing proper procedures, children were being skinned alive for entertainment. Because while committees debated rules of engagement, entire families were being wiped out for sport." His voice grew stronger. "I didn't enjoy any of it. Every order I gave, every life that was lost under my command, it stays with me. But I sleep at night knowing that thousands of people are alive because I was willing to make the hard choices." Lisa realized she was losing completely. The audience was with Jake now. She could see it in their faces. They weren't looking at him like a criminal anymore. They were looking at him like a protector. "Captain Morrison," she said desperately, "surely you understand that your actions set a dangerous precedent. If every military commander decides they know better than civilian leadership, then maybe fewer innocent people will die while politicians argue," Jake said simply. The studio erupted in applause. The applause died down slowly. Lisa Hamilton looked around the studio with growing panic. This was not how her show was supposed to go. She was the one who controlled the narrative. She was the one who asked the hard questions and got the answers people needed to hear. But Jake Morrison was changing everything. The audience was looking at him with respect, even admiration. Some of the women in the front row were wiping tears from their eyes. The men were nodding along with his words. Lisa tried to regain control. "Captain Morrison, while these stories are certainly tragic, we need to focus on facts, not emotions." Jake reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small device about the size of his thumb. "You want facts? I brought some." He pressed a button on the device, and suddenly the air above the interview table shimmered. A three-dimensional image appeared, floating in the space between Jake and Lisa. It showed a planet from orbit, green and blue and beautiful. "This is New Haven Colony before the Zentari arrived," Jake said. "Population 50,000. Mostly farming families who had left Earth to build a better life." He pressed the button again. The image changed. Now the planet looked different. Brown and gray patches covered much of the surface. Smoke rose from dozens of locations. "This is New Haven 6 months later." Lisa stared at the image. She had never seen anything like this projection technology. "How are you doing this?" "Military holographic display," Jake said simply. "We use them for mission briefings." The image changed again. Now they were looking at ground level. Buildings had been reduced to rubble. Bodies lay in the streets. Some of them were very small. "The Zentari didn't just kill the colonists," Jake explained. "They destroyed everything humans had built. Farms, schools, hospitals. They poisoned the water supply and salted the fields, so nothing would grow." Lisa tried to look away, but the images kept changing. A playground with swing sets twisted into metal sculptures. A school with children's drawings still hanging on. The walls, now covered in dark stains. "This is what your diplomatic solutions were supposed to prevent," Jake said. The audience was completely silent. Many people had their hands over their mouths. Some were openly crying. Lisa found her voice. "These images could be fake. Computer-generated. You could be showing us anything." Jake pressed another button. A timestamp appeared in the corner of the projection, along with official military codes. "These are from our reconnaissance drones, verified by 3 independent sources. The data is stored in military archives on Earth. You can check it yourself." He pressed the button again. Now the image showed a large building with a red cross painted on the roof. This was the main hospital in New Haven City. The Zentari converted it into what they called a research facility. The image zoomed in. Lisa wished it wouldn't. Inside the building, Metal tables were covered with things that had once been human. Equipment that was clearly designed for causing pain filled the rooms. They kept detailed records, Jake said quietly. Everything was documented. They wanted to study human pain responses. They were trying to find the most efficient ways to break our spirit. Lisa felt sick. Turn it off, please. This is what you've been defending, Jake said, but he clicked the button and the images disappeared. While you sat in your studio calling me a war criminal, this is what the Zentari were doing to innocent people. The studio was completely quiet except for the soft sounds of people crying. Lisa looked around desperately. Her producers behind the cameras looked as shocked as everyone else. No one was coming to help her. The intelligence reports, she said, weakly. The official documents said nothing about this level of... The official documents were sanitized, Jake interrupted. Politicians don't want voters to see what war really looks like. They give you clean numbers and simple explanations. They don't show you the reality. He stood up and walked closer to Lisa's desk. She unconsciously backed away from him. Do you know what the Galactic Council was doing while New Haven burned? Jake asked. They were holding committee meetings, discussing the proper diplomatic protocols for interspecies conflict resolution. Jake pulled out another device, this one larger. He set it on Lisa's desk and activated it. Documents appeared. In the air, official-looking papers with important seals and signatures. These are the actual diplomatic communications between Earth and the Zentari Empire during the first 6 months of the conflict. Lisa tried to read the floating documents. The language was formal and complicated, full of legal terms and diplomatic phrases. Can you read what Earth's negotiators were offering? Jake asked. Lisa squinted at the text. It looks like territorial concessions? Resource-sharing agreements? Earth was willing to give the Zentari 12 colony worlds in exchange for peace, Jake said. 12 worlds with human populations. The politicians were ready to hand over 3 million people to avoid a fight. The audience gasped. Several people stood up looking angry. That can't be right, Lisa said. Jake pressed another button. A new document appeared, this one with audio attached. A voice filled the studio, speaking in the cultured tones of Earth's diplomatic corps. We believe that relocating the colonial populations would be a small price to pay for maintaining peace with our galactic neighbors. The Zentari have made reasonable territorial claims, and we should respect their sovereignty. Lisa recognized the voice. It belonged to Ambassador Frank Wilson, one of Earth's most senior diplomats, a man she had interviewed many times, always portraying him as a voice of reason and peace. The ambassador was talking about giving away entire planets, Jake said. 3 million people were supposed to be relocated to make room for Zentari expansion. No one asked the colonists what they wanted. Where were they supposed to go? Asked a voice from the audience. Jake looked toward the speaker, a middle-aged man in an expensive suit. That wasn't worked out yet. The plan was to figure out the details after the agreement was signed. More documents appeared in the air. Jake walked around the desk, pointing to specific sections. Here's the part you'll really love. Earth's negotiators offered to restrict human military expansion in exchange for Zentari promises not to attack Earth itself. They were willing to leave the colonies defenseless, as long as the home planet stayed safe. Lisa felt the room turning against her completely. These weren't just military documents. They were proof that everything she had been told, everything she had believed about the conflict was wrong. The Zentari response was interesting, Jake continued. He pressed another button. A new voice filled the room, this one speaking in translated Zentari. Your offers are noted but insufficient. Human expansion must cease entirely. Existing colonies will be absorbed into our territory. Human populations will be relocated to facilities where they can be properly managed. Jake looked directly at Lisa. Properly managed. That's what they called the research facilities. The audience was getting restless. People were standing up, talking to each other, pointing at the documents floating above the interview table. This is what your diplomatic solution would have accomplished, Jake said. Every human colony handed over to be turned into laboratories. Millions of people transformed into test subjects. Lisa Hamilton realized that her career was ending in real time. Lisa Hamilton was desperate now. Her face had gone pale beneath the studio lights. The interview had become a disaster, but she had one last card to play. She reached under her desk and pulled out a thick folder. "Captain Morrison," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "Let's talk about your real motives. This isn't about protecting colonists, this is about money." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Money? You've made millions from this war. Military contracts, weapon sales, private security deals after your retirement." Lisa opened the folder and pulled out financial documents. These records show payments from defense companies, consulting fees from arms manufacturers. She held up the papers triumphantly. "You started this war to get rich. Every battle, every death, it was all to line your pockets," the audience murmured. Some people looked confused. Others seemed angry again, but now Jake couldn't tell if they were angry at him or at Lisa. Jake looked at the papers Lisa was waving around. "Where did you get those?" "I have sources." Investigative journalism requires digging deep to find the truth. "Those documents are classified military financial records," Jake said slowly. "They're not available to civilian journalists." Lisa smiled for the first time since the interview had started going wrong. A good reporter protects her sources. Jake activated his holographic device again. New documents appeared in the air above the desk. These looked different from the military reports he had shown before. They had corporate logos and legal seals. "Since we're sharing financial records," Jake said, "let's look at some others." The first document showed a payment record. Lisa's name was at the top along with a large sum of money. The payment came from something called Galactic Media Solutions. "This shows a payment to you for 2 million credits, Jake said. "Last month." Lisa's confident expression started to fade. "That's a legitimate consulting fee. I do work for media companies throughout the galaxy." Jake pressed a button. More documents appeared. Galactic Media Solutions is owned by Zentari Industrial Cooperative, a company controlled by the Zentari government. The audience started talking loudly. People were standing up, pointing at the floating documents. Lisa tried to grab for her papers, but Jake wasn't finished. "Here's another interesting payment," he said. New documents replaced the old ones. 5 million credits to Galactic Perspectives Network, your employer, also from Zentari Industrial Cooperative. Lisa was backing away from the desk now. "That's impossible. We don't take money from foreign governments." "Zentari Industrial isn't technically a government entity," Jake explained. "It's a private corporation. That makes the payments legal under Earth law. Very clever." More documents appeared. Jake walked around the desk, reading from them as they floated in the air. "Monthly payments to your network for the past 3 years. Always the same amount. Always from companies that trace back to Zentari. Control. The total comes to over 50 million credits." The audience was getting angry now. People were shouting questions at Lisa. Someone yelled, "How long have you been working for them?" Lisa tried to speak, but Jake wasn't done. He pressed another button and audio files started playing. Lisa's voice filled the studio, but these weren't from any of her shows. "The key is to make the military look bad without seeming unpatriotic," her recorded voice said. "We need to undermine support for aggressive action while maintaining plausible deniability." Another voice responded, clearly alien but speaking perfect English. "Our research shows that human audiences respond well to moral arguments. Focus on civilian casualties and environmental damage." Lisa's voice again. "What about the stories of Zentari war crimes? Some of the reports are pretty graphic." "Those reports are exaggerated by military propaganda. Focus on questioning the sources. Make people doubt what they're being told." The studio erupted. Half the audience was on their feet shouting at Lisa. The other half looked stunned. Lisa grabbed the microphone from her desk. "Those recordings are fake. They're computer-generated." Jake held up another device. "These are authenticated communications intercepts from military intelligence. Timestamps, voice analysis, digital signatures, all verified." He looked directly at the main camera. For 3 years, Lisa Hamilton and her network have been taking money from the Zentari government to spread propaganda designed to weaken human resistance to invasion. Lisa tried to run toward the exit, but security guards had already moved to block the doors. Jake's voice followed her. Every show criticizing the military, every interview attacking colonial defense policies, every story questioning war casualty reports, it was all paid for by the enemy. He pressed another button. Financial records filled the air around the studio. Payments to dozens of Earth media personalities, all traced back to Zentari sources. Lisa Hamilton wasn't the only one, Jake announced. Senator George Adams, who led the movement to cut military funding. Dr. Helen Carter, who questioned casualty reports. News anchor Tom Phillips, who called for immediate peace negotiations. All of them were being paid by the Zentari. The audience was in chaos now. People were shouting, crying, pushing toward the stage. Some were trying to get at Lisa, who was huddled in a corner with 2 security guards protecting her. Jake raised his voice over the noise. While human colonists were being tortured and killed, Earth's media was being bought and paid for by the murderers. Every argument for diplomatic solutions, every criticism of military action, every call for peace, it was all enemy propaganda designed to leave humanity defenseless. He activated one final hologram. This one showed an organizational chart with connections drawn between various media companies, political organizations, and peace groups. All of them led back to Zentari funding. The Zentari didn't just want to conquer human territory, Jake said. They wanted to conquer human minds. They spent decades building a network of influence on Earth, buying politicians and journalists and activists. They wanted humans to defeat themselves through their own moral arguments. The chart showed hundreds of connections. Politicians who had voted against military spending, journalists who had criticized colonial policies, activists who had protested military recruitment, scientists who had questioned intelligence reports about Zentari activities. They studied our culture and learned exactly how to manipulate us. Jake continued. They knew that humans value peace and moral behavior, so they convinced us that fighting back was immoral. They made us believe that defending ourselves made us the bad guys. Lisa Hamilton was crying now, still surrounded by security guards. The audience was demanding answers, but she had no words left. Her career was over. Her reputation was destroyed. More importantly, her role in weakening humanity's defenses was exposed for everyone to see. Jake looked around the chaotic studio one more time. The Zentari war isn't over, he said quietly, though his voice somehow carried over all the noise. They're still out there, still planning, still working to destroy us. But now you know how they really fight. Not just with weapons, but with lies. Not just on battlefields, but in your living rooms. He walked toward the exit as security guards tried to restore order. Behind him, Lisa Hamilton sat on the studio floor, surrounded by the wreckage of everything she had believed about herself and her work. 3 days after the interview, Jake Morrison sat in a small coffee shop in downtown New York. He was reading a newspaper with his picture on the front page. The headline read, "Hero or Traitor? Military Captain Exposes Media Conspiracy." The coffee shop was quieter than usual. People kept looking at him, but no one approached. Some seemed grateful. Others appeared angry. Most just looked confused. Jake's phone buzzed constantly. Interview requests, speaking offers, book deals. He ignored them all. He had said what needed to be said. Now he just wanted to go home. A young woman at the next table was watching the news on her tablet. The reporter was standing outside the UE Galactic Perspectives building, which had police tape across the entrance. The investigation continues into the extent of alien influence in Earth's media, the reporter was saying. 17 major news organizations are now under federal investigation. Over 200 journalists, politicians, and activists have been arrested for accepting foreign payments. Jake sipped his coffee and kept reading. The newspaper had quotes from military leaders praising his courage. It also had quotes from politicians calling him a dangerous extremist. Nothing had changed much. His phone rang. The caller ID showed a number he recognized. Pete Johnson, still serving on the Rim Worlds. Jake, you old fool. Pete's voice came through clearly despite the distance. What have you done? Told the truth. You've started a revolution. Half the colonies are calling for Earth's government to be replaced. The other half think you're a Zentari agent yourself. Jake almost smiled. At least they're talking about it. It's more than talking. There are riots in the streets. 3 senators have resigned. The Secretary of Defense is calling for your court-martial. Let him try. Pete was quiet for a moment. Jake, you need to be careful. A lot of powerful people want you dead right now. You've made some very dangerous enemies. I've been making dangerous enemies my whole career. After Pete hung up, Jake continued reading. The newspaper had a section about the international response to his revelations. The Martian colonies had cut all diplomatic ties with Earth. The Europa stations were demanding independence. Several rim-world colonies had declared martial law and were preparing for possible Zentari attacks. But other news was more encouraging. The Kepler Defense Force had received over 10,000 new recruits in the past 3 days. Young people from across the colonies were volunteering for military service. Weapons manufacturers were working overtime to meet increased orders from colonial governments. A man in an expensive suit approached Jake's table. He was older, maybe 60, with gray hair and tired eyes. Captain Morrison, I'm David Clark from the Senate Intelligence Committee. Jake looked up from his newspaper. Senator Clark, I know who you are. May I sit? Jake gestured to the empty chair. Senator Clark sat down carefully, looking around the coffee shop nervously. That was quite a performance the other night. Clark said. It wasn't a performance? No, I suppose it wasn't. Clark leaned forward. We need to talk. The government has some questions. I bet they do. There are people who want to arrest you, charge you with treason, espionage, violation of classified information protocols. Jake met his eyes. And what do you want? I want to know how much more evidence you have. Jake was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out a small memory chip. He set it on the table between them. Everything, he said simply. Clark stared at the chip. Everything? 5 years of intelligence reports, financial records, communication, intercepts, lists of every person on Earth who took Zentari money, documentation of every cover-up, every buried report, every ignored warning. My God. Your colleagues in the Senate won't like what's on there, Jake said. Neither will the President or most of the Supreme Court. Clark's hand trembled slightly as he reached for the chip. How high does this go? All the way to the top. The Zentari have been planning this for decades. They bought influence at every level of human society. What do you want in return for this? Jake stood up and left money on the table for his coffee. I want humanity to survive. Do whatever you need to do with that information. 2 weeks later, Jake was back on his ranch on New Montana. The house was small and simple, surrounded by rolling hills covered in purple grass. The sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded him of home. He was sitting on his porch when another news report came on his radio. The president had resigned. Half of Congress was under investigation. The Secretary of Defense had been arrested for accepting Zentari bribes to weaken colonial defenses, but there was other news too. The Galactic Council had formally condemned the Zentari Empire for their infiltration activities. 3 alien species had offered to provide military assistance to human colonies. The Kepler Defense Force had successfully driven off 2 Zentari, raids using tactics Jake had developed. Most importantly, the Zentari Empire had requested peace negotiations. Real negotiations this time, not the fake diplomatic discussions designed to buy time for more infiltration. Jake's neighbor, an old farmer named Roy, walked over from the next property. Roy had lost a son in the Zentari War. Heard the news? Roy said, settling into the chair next to Jake. Which news? All of it. The president, the arrests, the peace talks. Roy was quiet for a moment. Also heard they're going to give you some kind of medal. Jake made a sound that might have been laughter. I don't need any medals. Maybe not, but the rest of us need heroes. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sunset over the purple hills. In the distance, a transport ship was landing at the small spaceport. More colonists arriving to build new lives on the rim worlds. You think it's really over? Roy asked. Jake thought about the question. The Zentari were asking for peace, but they had asked for peace before. The corrupt politicians on Earth were gone, but there would be new politicians. The truth was out. But truth had a way of being forgotten when it became inconvenient. The Zentari war might be over, Jake said finally. But there will always be enemies. Some of them will come from space. Others will come from our own people who are willing to sell out humanity for money or power. So what do we do? Jake stood, up and stretched. His old bones creaked from too many years of combat and too many hard choices. But he felt lighter than he had in years. The truth was out. People knew what they were really fighting against. We stay vigilant, he said. We remember what we learned, and we never let anyone convince us that defending ourselves makes us the bad guys. The transport ship lifted off again, heading back toward Earth. Jake watched it disappear into the darkening sky. Somewhere out there, the Zentari were planning their next move. Somewhere else, other enemies were waiting for humanity to let its guard down. But for the first time in years, Jake Morrison slept peacefully. He had done his duty. He had told the truth. The rest was up to humanity itself.